Hello and welcome to my Uncharted 5 concept art. The aim of this project is to explore and develop my skills as a concept artist using a range of tools from Photoshop, ZBrush and other 3D pieces of software. I will be running you through my progress and detailing the processes I have used along the way, as well as critiquing certain aspects of the project that were successful and that weren't. I am aiming to deliver at least a piece of concept art related to a character and at least one piece of environmental concept art. These mood boards are specifically aimed at the origins of the Cyclops in Greek mythology, as well as popular culture. These reference images were selected because the character dwells in an underwater cave and they would be gaunt, malnourished and pale through lack of food and sunlight. Other reference collected was of ancient Greek clothing and weaponry, and they were obtained to keep the character authentic. First task, I began creating some thumbnails using ancient Greek clothing as reference, experimenting with different styles in Photoshop, integrating sashes, jewellery and trying to integrate an essence of weathered and age effects within the rags. I then used a process of creating modular pieces of clothing for more variation in the rags. The variations that are the strongest were the images that revealed more skin, as this would allow me to show off the Cyclops' skin conditions and blemishes. This next reference sheet focused on tribal culture, such as tattoos, scarring and paint. I did this because the characters would be cut off from the rest of the world for thousands of years and would have developed their own culture, and I wanted to showcase this. This next slide, I began to sketch my own versions of tribal culture, focusing on symbolism related to Atlantis and Poseidon, trying to focus on the Cyclops' eye as the main feature on the head, whilst also experimenting with the idea of whether it was evolution, sewn in, or cut from another and worn as a symbol for the gods. This next reference sheet I collected was to gain a sense of how a Cyclops' eye would fit into a skull and how skulls deform over time. I began by sketching out various skulls using this reference, focusing on unsettling forms that were human but almost inhuman or unrecognisable as human due to the conditions that they dwell in, whilst also focusing on a prominent eye socket for the eye. Because they were human, I still believe they should retain the original two eye sockets that we possess. The bottom left image is the one that I selected due to its elongated head and prominent eye socket on the form. I then moved into ZBrush because I believed seeing the skull in 3D would allow me to get a better sense of how the character would look overall. The Move tool in ZBrush allowed for a quick experimental change in shape for more deformities. This task paved the way for how the face and head would look as I added skin to the Cyclops using ZBrush. I decided that the stitching of the original eye sockets would help the character's intimidating nature, whilst also keeping the theme of the prominent Cyclops eye. This helps develop character narrative, as it asks a question to whether they had gone blind over time from being in a dark cave, or through their worship of Poseidon and his son Prometheus, allowed them to see again through sacrifice. I began painting over the head to try and input pale and weathered skin tones into the design. Because the head was sculpted, I moved on to silhouetting some poses for the rest of the character, focusing on trying to create a dynamic pose that was intimidating and in keeping with the theme. Number 3 was selected as he looks hunched over and unwell, while still being intimidating. With the pose chosen, I began sculpting the body of the character using ZBrush, using reference from the pose and previous mood boards for a skinny, gaunt creature. Using the transpose tool to experiment with the position of the limbs, I used some noise to try and create a coarse, weathered skin texture, and this sculpt also helped with creating a dynamic lighting for the character ready to be painted over. I then moved the character into Marmoset Toolbag to try and light the character in a similar way to how he would be lit in his environment, such as a bright fire torch light and an ambient blue light from the water surrounding him. I then began to paint over, adding some skin textures in the process. This wasn't as successful because the light took away too much from the character's skin and the character still looked like a 3D model and not a painting. Now I had a clear idea of what the head would look like. I began with more iterations of tribal paint, also looking at colour variations with an experiment with bioluminescence that could have been created using deep sea creatures. Using the sculpt, I began to collect textures and using Photoshop made them tileable. I experimented with different texture overlays using squid skin, elephant skin, and human skin conditions such as boils and cracks to give a sense of the blemished, coarse, and unhygienic skin. I then began with a full paint over using a range of texture brushes on Photoshop, trying to bring everything together. I added scraggly hair to make it look like it was falling out, and then I used the liquify tool to make the pose more dynamic and to make him skinnier and his shoulders not as broad. I also used reference to make his hands and feet more deformed with the addition of webbed feet due to the surrounding water, and uncut nails along with arthritic and bony fingers. I then worked into the rags that I'd chosen and added colour variations to experiment with what worked best, finding again that less clothing was the way to go, but also each different rag looked like an enemy class system, such as grunts and warriors. The tints of red working to help symbolise danger. I also added blood splats on the clothing for a more aged and authentic look. I then added weaponry to each character and began working on a background using ambient blue light. This was not as successful as I expected due to the character needing slightly more development and the light source was not drawing the viewer's eye to the Cyclops' head, although the weaponry did add to the intimidating features of the character. I continued to develop the character further by trying to draw more attention to the head by focusing on the Cyclops eye. I did a study on human and creature eyes to get a sense of how the eye would sit in the skull and how the eyelids would work around it. I then added colour variation by again focusing on bioluminescence to draw attention to the eye. I chose the green variation because it adds heavy colour variation to the character. I then developed the sash further using Greek symbols to make the sash look more ornate, whilst also using the warp tool to create folds and the eraser to create wear and tear. I also added brass texture overlays to the arm guards to make them look weathered and realistic. Furthermore, adding a green tint to the skin allowed for them to seem more malnourished and sun deprived, allowing for the deep red skin conditions to pop out within the skin for a much better effect. I then redesigned the backdrop, adding a warmer backdrop to make the Cyclops stand out more, whilst also adding an area of high contrast behind the head to draw the viewer's eye to the head. Now moving on to the environment. My first task was to create reference images on concept art, deep sea caves and some famous painters such as Turner, Piranesi and Friedrich. I chose these for the atmospheric mood that they produce in their paintings. I also looked at concept art that had dynamic perspective and that would help me display depth, grandeur and scale within my work. Looking at Naughty Dog concept artists such as Aaron Limonick can help me emulate the realistic feel that I am aiming for. I began by sketching some thumbnails using light, medium and dark tones, trying to experiment with different perspectives and depth of field in order to make my image dynamic and create that grandeur and scale within my image. I also experimented with portrait and landscape to see which would produce the desired effects I was aiming for. I then began to work into some of the images, adding more details to get more of a sense of how the image would look. Adding depth and trying to draw the eye to the huge statue of Poseidon using a high contrast on that particular part of the image. This piece of work displays good perspective, but I think that moving the statue to the centre of the image would draw the viewer's eye, and then it would be the centre point of the image, whilst also having the cityscape circle around the statue to again draw the eye in. This next image has a dynamic perspective, but I think the image is too central, and after consideration, I believe one of the portrait pieces would work as a variation and may show a bit more of scale in the image. The next step for these environment pieces will be to move into the 3D piece of software, such as 3D Coat or ZBrush, to begin to sculpt out buildings, temples, and the statue, in order to block out the scene for a render and eventual paint over. Rendering in grayscale means I can set up a light source and see how the light would flow across the image. And finally, to the other villain character I wanted to produce. This was the siren that surrounded the city's entrance and protected it. The mood boards show references to original Greek sirens, which were winged women, and sirens in popular culture, which were more mermaid-like. I also focused on deep-sea creatures which are unsettling and scary, and how they use bioluminescence to attract prey. This could be similar to the siren song that lures sailors in. I followed the same processes as the Cyclops and began to silhouette some strong shapes using deep-sea creatures as reference, as well as using modular pieces for variation. Pieces that are the strongest were the silhouettes containing the jellyfish tentacles, as they can resemble a woman's dress. This could also be good for narrative, as they could seem friendly from afar, but deadly up close. The next steps on this project would be to work into the silhouettes, adding variation in tones, and then moving to ZBrush to sculpt ideas ready to be painted over. Thank you for listening to my screencast, and that is Uncharted 5 concept art.